Serious, Germans of Reddit, in what ways, if at all, does Germany recognize World War II veterans? One of my grandfathers was in the German army and fought on the Eastern Front during World War II. I haven't discussed his experiences with him about it in much detail, largely because he is understandably uncomfortable discussing it. I do know that he receives a pension from the German government for his military service at the time. The general consensus is that everybody was forced to join the Wehrmacht, even if they did volunteer. Every vet has some, more or less legitimate excuse for doing so. It is completely understandable that no sensible person nowadays would be proud to say that they just walked up to the gates of the army of Nazi Germany and yelled "I want in," though quite a lot did. Most vets are well respected today. However, not because they served their country but because they managed to survive that living heck and maybe even a Soviet POW camp. Obviously that is today's situation because the few WW2 vets that are still alive were young men, even teenagers, when they were drafted towards the end of the war. So one can assume that they weren't the ones who committed the most heinous crimes or start the whole thing in the first place. That was a lot different in the 50s and 60s. Vets were often frowned upon, particularly by the younger generation, as they were always suspected of being involved in war crimes or being a Nazi in general. It does have a lot to do with Germany's domestic politics in the 50s and early 60s. They basically just reset their minds to 1932 and went on as if nothing had ever happened. Dark times for young people. The military is still rather unpopular even today, often considered as a bunch of borderline alcoholics with little education and far-right tendencies who just couldn't cut it in the real world. Of course that's a gross oversimplification, but many people are still under the impression of how they were treated by the petty officers during their mandatory service, which was just recently abolished. I actually live in Germany in a small town which happens to be home to a 90-year-old German World War II veteran, and took him to the 70th anniversary of the Normandy invasion last year. He was stationed there during the invasion and was taken prisoner and later sent to a POW camp in the USA, where he learned to speak English and was treated pretty much as any other human would, seeing the Americans around him as normal people and not enemies. He was not a convinced Nazi and never killed or shot at anyone, and was rather pacifistic during the war since he was forced to fight like many others. Many different news outlets interviewed him at the 70th anniversary, and none antagonized him. He also met many American veterans whom he embraced and talked with like old friends. The organizers of the anniversary events were happy to have him there, and he even got to shake the hands of President Obama and Queen Elizabeth. Among Germans he is recognized as a man who suffered his way through the war, as many others did, and he is not shunned for having been a German soldier, nor is he celebrated for fighting for the Nazis, but simply seen as a man who did as he was told, and did what he had to survive. If you want to know more, his name is Paul Goals, look him up. In my family we never really talked about it. My grandfather was happy to share some stories about his time as a POW in France but not about his time as a soldier, and I'm pretty sure I never really asked. There is a German expression called Totschweigen which basically means to keep quiet about something to make it die. That is how many families approach their World War II history. The concept of veteran doesn't exist in Germany at all. There are old people who've been in the war. They are not regarded as either good or bad. They are just old people with stories. Although, this was when I was young. Very few are still alive, and young people serving in the Bundeswehr, especially those who've been to Afghanistan and such, aren't regarded as veterans. They are regarded as idiots. Perhaps that is because there was little concept of a divide between civilian versus military at that time in Germany. Every male between 1640 alive in that time period fought in the war, and most of them died. If you were a woman or a child, you saw bombing and abuse. The concept of a veteran doesn't make as much sense when everyone was traumatized by the war. My grandfather and my granduncle both were veterans. The first one was an SS guy and a loyal Nazi that never thought that he did something wrong during the war. He was very high ranked and as people be executed he told these stories when I was drunk. Something that happened often during the last years of his life. He died some years ago. He was still keeping his Luger pistol and committed suicide after was diagnosed with Alzheimer. Beside all the Nazi crap he was a very kind, good looking and noble man. My granduncle on the other side was in the Wehrmacht and fought in Stalingrad and got shot for 3 times, so that was brought on until the whole situation got really bad. He died a few years ago too. We still keep his uniform in a box. The thing in Germany is, you can't tell stories like this with pride. We were the bad guys. We set the world on fire. And even if some of the German soldiers were good people, they were fighting for the wrong things. So veterans don't tell their stories and kids never hear them. And in some years we will only remember the stuff that's shown in documentaries. My 90-year-old grandfather is a World War II veteran. He was ordered to serve at the defense of Berlin against the Red Army. He is, considering his high age, still at full mental health and can remember everything. He told me that he tried to escape army services on different occasions. One time when he had some sort of vacation, he just stayed at a different location. He visited his girlfriend instead of his parents, without telling anyone. This way he had more time to ignore conscription orders and stuff like that. Well, because he did not receive them, and the penalty for that was much lighter than real deserting. It was his way of fighting the regime without getting in too much danger. He is very open-minded towards other cultures and sexual orientations. One of his granddaughters is gay and he states that the only thing that matters is that she is happy, which is quite impressive for his age considering the time of his socialization. In general, World War II veterans will neither be praised nor hated, since we learn in like 37,374 sessions in history class how the world was and what would have happened if people would have acted otherwise. Ist just a sad part of our history in which some of our elderly played their roles and on the other hand those who acted by their beliefs. My parents, who are in their mid-50s now, have been more critical towards the World War II veteran generation since their parents were the ones involved in that zeitgeist was quite different. The people who get praised though are the anti-regime people like the Geschwister Scholl, who are considered national heroes nowadays. After all, heroes and history are made by winners. I was trying to decode a message like I was on Alep. If you are American, you need to understand that there are vast differences between the way the general populace views the military. The Bundeswehr goes to great lengths to portray itself as just another employer. Thus it is usually viewed as any other career. To clarify, I'm 25 and I'd be super weirded out if someone talked about being in the Bundeswehr and someone thanked them for their service. I can get thanking a firefighter, but soldiers not so much. This is actually a problem to many soldiers who feel shunned by the general populace. There is a big anti-military sentiment in Germany. Like if you work for Rheinmetall you will catch weird looks and get quizzed on how you justify building weapons. Consequently you wouldn't know the vets from any other old pal. I met a few. My gramps, another guy, both were POW in Russia, and none are particularly happy to talk about it. Some will not want to talk about anything and just remark that those were crap times, and some will tell personal stories. They are not revered or shunned. A few years ago a guy in his late 80s was tried for war crimes, which still is not as uncommon as you would expect. He was part of the SS though. All in all I would describe it as regular respect, mixed with some pity for living in crap times. The whole "my country right or wrong" is not a strong sentiment in Germany these days. Thanks for asking such a thought-provoking question. My grandfather was stationed in a Red Cross city, a place solely for the wounded, and lost one of his legs there when the Allies bombed the place. Most Germans I know feel pity for them. They were forced to fight. There was no honor in it. Or in short, we don't talk about it since we can't change the past anyway. It's more like a one-time thing for the grandchildren to scare them from thinking war is honorable, legitimate or something like that. We don't. The only people that lived during World War II that get some recognition are people who survived the concentration camps, and there are only a few of them left. My granddad fought in the war and was sent to Italy, I think. He never spoke about it when he returned and nobody really asked. 2 of his 4 brothers died in battle. I don't know where, and also his dad. So did many of his friends. Most people in Germany wish the war had never happened, so celebrating people who were part of it seems odd. Today doing military service is kind of frowned upon. Mostly people who have no other option join the military and they are regarded as rather stupid for doing it. It has a rednecky taste to it. War in general is seen as unnecessary and wrong, so taking part in it means that you're part of the problem. My grandfather turned 90 the other week. He was aboard a German minesweeping boat in the English Channel in the early 1940s, which ironically hit a mine and sank the boat. He was captured by an English boat and nearly died from a shrapnel wound in his stomach. He was moved around various POW camps and was set to work as a builder. Each day he would pass my English grandmother whilst he was on the back of a lorry on the way to a building site. One day he threw flowers and a note, and they started meeting up in secret. I swear his life could be made into an incredible film. Since my grandmother passed, he has opened up a lot more about his time in the war and has some unbelievable stories. I've started asking him a lot of questions about it and recording our conversation to capture the information that would otherwise be lost before it's too late. To go back to Arp's question, all I know is that after the war ended he was eventually sent back to Germany and was given 187 Deutschmarks. He gave some to his family and then came back to England. He still receives a German pension as recompense for being in the war. A lot of people talking about modern day in this thread. Veterans of the World War II, or the few who are still alive, are not recognized in any sort of public ceremonies or the like in Germany. It should be noted, however, that the dead are. You will find a monument in pretty much every single village, town, city in Germany with the names of the dead from both world wars written on them. It's a good reminder of how much the war cost us. Especially when you see such a monument in some tiny farming village and there are almost 50 names on it. I guess the closest we have to war veterans of World War II is the concept of the Trauerfrau, or the rubble women, who cleaned up after the glorious armies fought and destroyed entire cities because, you know, when you dehumanize a foe in EU, there are no civilians. There are only acceptable casualties to break the fighting will of the German people, and in general, we call them Oma and Opa. My grandfather was a bomber pilot over Eastern Europe, and he hated every second of it. We are aware of the past, but everyone who used to be a soldier and still alive was nothing more than a pawn. And B, military today is seen as necessity, and nothing to be proud of. You don't see people running around announcing their veteran status at all, and it is something that is mostly ignored. Why would you make a special effort to honor individuals when basically 100% of the male populace at that time fought in the war? Many people here point to shame and the fact of Germany committing unimaginable atrocities during World War II. I think it is much more mundane when honoring World War II veterans becomes synonymous with honoring old people. No one stands out. It doesn't really make any sense. Austrian here. We have a huge monument in the middle of Vienna ordered by Stalin, thanking the Red Army for liberating Vienna from the fascist oppressors. So there's that. Also, lots of monuments mourning the dead of both world wars. As for personal stories, my grandfather volunteered for the German Navy in '38. His destroyer struck a mine in 1941. He got captured by the Soviets and spent 7 years in a gulag. As far as I know in mining, I think the death rate of German POWs captured in 1941 was around 90%. So it's a miracle he returned. They even had made a funeral for him already. Although, survived. He committed suicide in 1968. PTSD, I think. I really would have liked to talk to him about this whole thing. So, yeah, the war is seen as a very negative affair. I'm glad I didn't have to see it. My Opa fought in World War II in a tank battalion on the Eastern Front. He was held prisoner of war for numerous years. He was very honest with me growing up and has told me many things. Horrid stories. He actually suffered from PTSD for a long time before he passed. He would always worry about money. At times he'd get thousands of dollars in cash from the bank. And food, he would buy basic things like bread and butter and stuff their freezer. And then he'd still be worried that we'd go hungry. He was studying to be a teacher but had to join the military at some point and was very upset about it. Veterans in Germany are not honored as they are here, but they do not get shunned. I think it's a quiet understanding that a lot of soldiers did what they had to do to survive and to save their families. It seems like mostly shame. My travels to Berlin showed me that they still have signs where Jews used to live, encouraging the people to never forget the atrocities they committed. We don't, beyond a few right-wing extremists. Why do Americans and British? I've heard of things like Armed Forces Day at sporting events. This sounds like something out of a Sacha Baron Cohen film to me. You have been visited by the bee of jazz. Like this video to have your ears filled with cool jazz. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.